When the first American B-17s crossed into German-controlled airspace, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't help but laugh. These massive bombers moved like flying barns, slow, bulky, and easy to spot against the clouds. From the ground, they looked like sitting ducks. From the cockpits of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, they looked like easy kills. German radio chatter was full of jokes about the flying fortress that would fall apart the moment real fighters hit it. To the Luftwaffe, it wasn't a fortress, it was a dream target. But then something strange happened. Those first waves of laughter started to fade when the smoke cleared. Even after brutal attacks, formation after formation of B-17s somehow kept their shape. German pilots who had emptied their guns into one bomber would watch in disbelief as it limped home, engines burning, tail riddled with holes, yet still flying. The Americans were building something different, something that refused to die easily, and that unnerved the Luftwaffe more than they wanted to admit. At its core, the Boeing B-17 wasn't supposed to be a miracle machine. It was born out of pre-war optimism, a four-engine bomber built to carry heavy payloads over long distances while defending itself with machine guns on every side. But what the engineers created went beyond expectations. They gave it armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a structure so tough that even when it looked torn apart, it could still keep its crew alive. The Germans didn't know it yet, but they were about to meet an aircraft that would turn the skies of Europe into a war within a war, a battle for air supremacy, unlike anything before. The Luftwaffe had dominated Europe with speed and precision. Their blitzkrieg tactics tore through Poland, France, and the Low Countries in a storm of steel and fire. Their fighter pilots were some of the best in the world, with years of combat experience. To them, the B-17 was just another challenge, one they expected to crush. But the Americans had something the Luftwaffe underestimated: numbers, technology, and a relentless will to adapt. When the first waves of flying fortresses appeared over occupied territory, they weren't just bringing bombs, they were bringing a new kind of war. In those early days, the skies above Europe turned into a brutal testing ground. German fighters would swarm the bomber formations like wolves, diving in from the sun, raking the air with cannon fire. Yet each attack revealed something new. The B-17s fought back, each one bristling with up to 1350 caliber guns. The air became a storm of tracers, red and green lines of death crisscrossing in every direction. German pilots began to realize this wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't a target. They were flying into a fortress of fire. And that was just the beginning. Because before long, the very same pilots who mocked the flying fortress would find themselves facing an enemy that seemed impossible to break. But to understand how that happened, you have to know where the B-17 came from, and why the Germans were so confident they could destroy it. Before the war turned the sky into a battleground, Boeing engineers in Seattle were already dreaming of something that seemed almost impossible at the time: a bomber that could fight its own battles. In the early 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps still believed bombers didn't need much defense. The thinking was simple: the bomber will always get through. If it could fly high enough and fast enough, who could stop it? But Boeing didn't want to rely on wishful thinking. They wanted to build a plane that could survive even when everything went wrong. The result was the Model 299, a sleek four-engine giant that looked like science fiction for its era. During its first demonstration flight in 1935, the press couldn't believe what they were seeing. Reporters called it a flying fortress, and the nickname stuck. The plane's defensive power was unlike anything before it: multiple gun positions that could cover nearly every direction of attack. To a generation used to fabric-covered biplanes, this metal monster was a glimpse of the future. When war finally erupted in Europe, that future arrived fast. Britain was already under siege from the Luftwaffe, and the Americans knew their time was coming. The B-17 wasn't perfect. It was expensive, heavy, and complicated to build. But it had one advantage that would change everything: durability. It could take punishment that would destroy most aircraft and still bring its crew home. Stories soon spread through U.S. airfields, tales of bombers limping back with half a wing missing or a nose blown apart, landing gear jammed, yet somehow managing to land safely. That toughness wasn't an accident. Boeing's engineers built redundancy into almost every system. 4 engines meant that even if 2 failed, the bomber could still stay airborne. The self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of turning into a fireball after a hit. The structure of the wings and fuselage was reinforced, so even when riddled with bullets, the frame held together. Inside, gunners manned positions in the nose, the tail, the waist, and the top turret, each one a small fortress of its own. But to the Luftwaffe, all of this looked like overkill. German air doctrine focused on fast, surgical strikes, tactical air power that supported ground troops, not lumbering bombers flying in daylight. When they first heard about the American Flying Fortress, they saw it as a joke. "Too big, too slow, too easy," some German officers remarked. A few even joked that it would make good target practice for their young pilots. They didn't realize that in trying to fight these machines, they'd be walking into the deadliest air duels of the war. When the B-17 finally joined combat in Europe, it carried not just bombs, but a philosophy. That precision bombing at high altitude could cripple an enemy's war machine. It was bold, almost arrogant, flying in daylight, deep into enemy territory, with nothing but tight formations and overlapping gunfire for protection. To most observers, it looked suicidal, but the Americans were convinced the B-17 could handle it. And for a while, it did. At least, until the Luftwaffe decided to teach the Flying Fortress a lesson. What came next would test every promise Boeing ever made, and nearly shatter the myth of the invincible fortress before it truly began. When the first B-17s of the U.S. 8th Air Force lifted off from English airfields in 1942, few on either side realized they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most brutal air campaigns in history. The American plan was simple, at least on paper. Bomb Germany by day, let the British bomb by night, and crush the Nazi war machine from above. But to the Luftwaffe, it sounded ridiculous. Daylight raids? Slow bombers flying in formation without fighter escort? They almost couldn't believe their luck. German ace pilots, men who'd torn apart Spitfires and Hurricanes over the Channel, waited eagerly for these new American targets. They called the B-17 a flying cow. Its wingspan alone made it hard to miss, and the first few encounters seemed to prove their mockery right. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s set out for their first raid on occupied France. The mission was small, symbolic more than strategic, but to the Luftwaffe it was an invitation. Fighters pounced from the clouds, diving straight through the bomber formations. When the Americans returned to base, some planes were shredded. Gunners were dead or wounded. The German radio network buzzed with laughter. "So, this is the Flying Fortress?" At first, the joke was on the Americans. Formation flying wasn't enough to stop veteran German pilots. Every pass tore holes through aluminum and flesh. The Luftwaffe's FW-190s and Bf-109s ripped into bomber groups from head-on where their defensive guns were weakest. The Americans learned the hard way that courage alone couldn't protect a bomber. In those early months, the skies over Europe became a slaughterhouse. Bright streaks of tracer fire, black bursts of flak, and the slow, tragic spirals of dying fortresses. But there was something the Germans didn't count on: how fast the Americans adapted. Each mission became a lesson. Crews refined their formations, closing ranks so tightly that the wall of machine gun fire became nearly solid. Engineers reinforced weak spots and added extra guns, even jury-rigged mounts in windows and doors. And most importantly, the Americans refused to back down. The more the Luftwaffe mocked them, the more determined the bomber crews became. Soon, the mockery turned into something else, a kind of uneasy respect. German pilots began noticing that even when they shredded a B-17, it didn't always fall. There are accounts of fortresses flying home with tails half gone, wings full of holes, engines coughing smoke, and still making it across the channel. One bomber came back with an entire section of its fuselage torn open. You could see daylight straight through it, yet the crew survived. That kind of resilience started to get under the Luftwaffe's skin. Still, the Americans paid dearly for every raid. The deeper they flew into German territory, the heavier the losses became. By late 1943, the term Flying Fortress sounded more like wishful thinking than reality. The Luftwaffe had learned how to exploit every weakness: head-on attacks, massed fighter waves, even experimental weapons. For the bomber crews, every mission felt like a one-way trip. The laughter in the Luftwaffe's ready rooms hadn't stopped, but it had changed tone. There was a new edge to it, the nervous kind that hides fear. And soon, the Americans would push deeper into the heart of Germany, where the Luftwaffe planned to crush the myth of the fortress once and for all. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard of ambition. What started as confident mockery from the Luftwaffe had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Every time they thought they'd found a way to break the American bombers, the enemy adapted. Yet the Germans weren't about to give up. The same innovation that had once given them the edge in the Blitz was now their last hope. They began throwing everything they had into the fight, and some of it bordered on madness. Standard machine guns and 20mm cannons weren't cutting it anymore. The B-17s were too tough, too numerous, and too well defended. So the Luftwaffe loaded their fighters with heavier weapons, 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart with a single hit. Pilots like those in the elite JG-26 Abbeville boys learned to fire from long range, sending shells that could detonate inside a B-17's fuselage like miniature grenades. The effect was devastating when it worked. But the trade-off was speed and agility. Loaded down with extra weight, German fighters became slower, easier targets for the P-51s now prowling the skies. Still, the Luftwaffe pushed further. They introduced new tactics: Sturmgruppen, or storm groups, squadrons of heavily armored FW-190s that attacked in tight wedges, charging head-on into bomber formations. It was a terrifying sight, black-nosed fighters diving straight through a storm of .50-caliber fire, ramming or exploding alongside their targets. The courage, or desperation, of those pilots was staggering. Some missions saw entire squadrons wiped out within minutes. Then came the rockets. The Germans developed air-to-air weapons like the Werfer Granit 21, a 21 rocket designed to break up tight bomber formations. They would fire from below or from a distance, creating explosions that forced the B-17s to scatter. It was chaos in the sky, streaks of smoke, bursts of flame, fragments of aluminum spinning toward the earth. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. Losses among the bombers spiked. But the Americans adapted again, closing formations even tighter, their discipline unshaken. Behind the lines, German engineers were sketching ideas that bordered on science fiction. Jet fighters like the Me-262, rocket interceptors like the Me-163 Comet, even plans for air-to-air guided missiles. On paper, they were revolutionary. In reality, they came too late and in too few numbers to stop the tide. The Luftwaffe's biggest problem wasn't imagination, it was exhaustion. Pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were shortened from months to weeks. The aces who had once dominated the sky were now leading squadrons of boys barely out of school. Every sortie was a gamble, and every lost pilot was irreplaceable. And yet, even as the airfields shrank and the fuel ran out, the Germans made one last move that revealed just how desperate they'd become. They captured several downed B-17s, patched them up, and flew them themselves. Codenamed Dornier Du 200 in secret reports, these stolen fortresses were used to test weaknesses, mimic bomber formations, and lure American fighters into ambushes. It was a bold trick, but it also proved something deeper. The Luftwaffe had stopped laughing. They were studying the very machine they once mocked, trying to understand why it refused to die. And what they discovered would shake their confidence to its core, because when they looked inside the Flying Fortress, they realized it wasn't just a plane, it was a system built for survival. By 1944, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard of ambition. What started as confident mockery from the Luftwaffe had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Every time they thought they'd found a way to break the American bombers, the enemy adapted. Yet the Germans weren't about to give up. The same innovation that had once given them the edge in the Blitz was now their last hope. They began throwing everything they had into the fight, and some of it bordered on madness. Standard machine guns and 20mm cannons weren't cutting it anymore. The B-17s were too tough, too numerous, and too well defended. So the Luftwaffe loaded their fighters with heavier weapons, 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart with a single hit. Pilots like those in the elite JG-26 Abbeville boys learned to fire from long range, sending shells that could detonate inside a B-17's fuselage like miniature grenades. The effect was devastating, when it worked. But the trade-off was speed and agility. Loaded down with extra weight, German fighters became slower, easier targets for the P-51s now prowling the skies. Still, the Luftwaffe pushed further. They introduced new tactics, Sturmgruppen, or storm groups, squadrons of heavily armored FW-190s that attacked in tight wedges, charging head-on into bomber formations. It was a terrifying sight, black-nosed fighters diving straight through a storm of .50-caliber fire, ramming or exploding alongside their targets. The courage, or desperation, of those pilots was staggering. Some missions saw entire squadrons wiped out within minutes. Then came the rockets. The Germans developed air-to-air weapons like the Werfer Granit 21, a 21-cm rocket designed to break up tight bomber formations. They would fire from below or from a distance, creating explosions that forced the B-17s to scatter. It was chaos in the sky, streaks of smoke, bursts of flame, fragments of aluminum spinning toward the earth. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. Losses among the bombers spiked. But the Americans adapted again, closing formations even tighter, their discipline unshaken. Behind the lines, German engineers were sketching ideas that bordered on science fiction. Jet fighters like the Me-262, rocket interceptors like the Me-163 Comet, even plans for air-to-air guided missiles. On paper, they were revolutionary. In reality, they came too late and in too few numbers to stop the tide. The Luftwaffe's biggest problem wasn't imagination, it was exhaustion. Pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were shortened from months to weeks. The aces who had once dominated the sky were now leading squadrons of boys barely out of school. Every sortie was a gamble, and every lost pilot was irreplaceable. And yet, even as the airfields shrank and the fuel ran out, the Germans made one last move that revealed just how desperate they'd become. They captured several downed B-17s, patched them up, and flew them themselves. Codenamed Dornier Du 200 in secret reports, these stolen fortresses were used to test weaknesses, mimic bomber formations, and lure American fighters into ambushes. It was a bold trick, but it also proved something deeper. The Luftwaffe had stopped laughing. They were studying the very machine they once mocked, trying to understand why it refused to die. And what they discovered would shake their confidence to its core, because when they looked inside the Flying Fortress, they realized it wasn't just a plane, it was a system built for survival. When a Luftwaffe recovery team found its first mostly intact B-17 lying in a field in occupied Europe, curiosity outweighed victory. The wrecked machine looked monstrous up close, a beast of rivets and armor, twice the size of their own fighters. The Germans patched it up, marked it with black crosses, and flew it back to a test airfield under heavy guard. From that day forward, they weren't just trying to destroy the Flying Fortress. They were trying to understand it. Inside the hangars at Rechlin, Germany's top aviation engineers and test pilots examined every inch of the bomber. They expected to find brute strength and nothing more. What they discovered instead was precision, a brutal kind of elegance. The B-17 wasn't just heavy, it was balanced. Every cable, every control surface, every gun position was designed with a purpose. The defensive layout alone left them stunned. Gunners could cover nearly every angle of attack, overlapping arcs of fire that forced enemy fighters into kill zones. They flew it too. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hans-Werner Lerche, known for testing captured Allied planes, took the controls of one of these B-17s and put it through maneuvers. He expected a lumbering giant. Instead, he found an aircraft that was surprisingly stable, even graceful for its size. It climbed steadily, handled predictably, and absorbed punishment that would have shattered German bombers. The more they tested it, the clearer it became. This wasn't luck or superstition keeping the B-17 alive. It was design. What really astonished them was the human factor. The B-17 wasn't just built tough, it was built for teamwork. Every position had a defined role. Every gunner had a line of sight that connected with the others. Communication lines tied the crew together, literally and psychologically. American crews trained relentlessly in formation discipline, gunnery coordination, and emergency drills. To German eyes, it was alien. Their bombers relied on speed and minimal defense. The Americans relied on cooperation, and it worked. As the tests continued, the Luftwaffe recorded their findings and circulated them in internal reports. One summarized it bluntly. The American bomber is not invincible, but it is made with the understanding that no single part of it may fail. That sentence haunted German strategists. The B-17 didn't just resist destruction, it planned for it. 4 engines meant 1 or 2 could die without dooming the crew. The structure could twist, bend, even burn, but still bring men home. Every bolt screamed one message: survival at any cost. In some ways, the Luftwaffe's testing backfired. Pilots who once laughed at the fortress now spoke about it with awe. They knew what it could do, and what it would take to stop it. Yet by the time those reports reached Berlin, it was too late. The skies were already filling with more of them. For every B-17 that fell, Another seemed to take its place, until the horizon itself looked like an endless wall of silver wings. And now, those wings were turning deeper into Germany, carrying not just bombs, but a promise to bring the war home. What came next would turn the very air above the Reich into a storm of steel and fire. By 1944, the B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was a message. Every time its engines roared to life on English airfields, it told the world that the Allies were taking the war straight to Hitler's doorstep. The Luftwaffe, once the master of European skies, now faced waves of silver-skinned bombers that stretched horizon to horizon. Each mission cut deeper into the Reich's heart, targeting factories, rail lines, oil plants, the veins that kept Germany's war machine alive. But there was a cost. To the men inside those fortresses, deep penetration missions were a daily walk into hell. Hours of flight through flak-filled skies, the constant drone of engines, the sudden shriek of shells ripping through aluminum. It was a kind of slow torture. Crewmen described how the air itself smelled like metal and cordite. At 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped so low that blood could freeze in seconds. Oxygen masks iced over. Frostbite claimed fingers before the enemy did, and through it all, they flew straight and steady, because breaking formation meant death for everyone else. Below, the German civilians and soldiers who watched these raids unfold felt something they hadn't known since the early days of the war: fear. For years, the Luftwaffe had been the hunter. Now, Germany was the prey. Sirens wailed day and night. The thunder of engines became a sound that children learned to dread. Entire cities disappeared under blankets of smoke. The psychological toll was immense. To many Germans, the B-17s seemed unstoppable, an iron storm that no flak gun or fighter could hold back for long. In the sky, the battles grew more savage. Flak batteries filled the air with black clouds of shrapnel, while what was left of the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept the formations. The German fighters that did manage to climb into range were often met by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts before they could even get close. Pilots described looking up and seeing hundreds of fortresses above them, sunlight glinting off their wings like mirrors of doom. From the ground, it looked almost unreal, majestic and terrifying at once. Witnesses later said the sky would seem to burn. Tracer fire and flak bursts stitched through the formations, and the B-17s returned fire in every direction. When one went down, it didn't fall quietly. It spiraled in flames, leaving a trail of smoke that marked the sacrifice of 10 men at a time. But for every bomber that fell, dozens more pressed on, dropping tons of bombs on targets that had once seemed untouchable. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Each attempt to stem the tide only bled them further. More pilots lost, more airfields bombed, more fuel gone. The psychological advantage had flipped completely. German soldiers who once joked about the flying fortresses now watched them in grim silence, knowing each raid brought the Reich closer to collapse. And yet, for the men inside the fortresses, survival didn't feel like victory. Every empty seat on the return flight was a reminder of the cost. The sky might have belonged to them, but it was paved with ghosts. Still, the Americans kept flying because they knew that if they stopped, the war would drag on forever. And by now, the Luftwaffe was beginning to crumble under the very fire it once commanded. By late 1944, the skies above Europe told a new story, one written in smoke, steel, and exhaustion. The once fearsome Luftwaffe, which had laughed at the first flying fortresses only 2 years before, was now breaking apart. Its aces were dead or grounded, its new pilots barely trained, and its fuel reserves so low that many planes couldn't even take off. What remained of Hitler's proud Air Force was a shadow of its former self, and that shadow was being hunted. The Americans now owned the daylight sky. P-51 Mustangs escorted massive fleets of B-17s all the way to Berlin and back, cutting down any German fighter that dared rise to meet them. The Luftwaffe's old tactics, head-on assaults, rocket barrages, armored storm groups, were all but useless now. Each sortie meant staggering losses. Some Luftwaffe squadrons lost half their pilots in a single day. Commanders who once bragged of driving the fortresses into the sea now whispered a quieter truth. The sky belonged to the enemy. But the real symbol of this turning point wasn't the Mustang. It was the B-17 itself. Its reputation for survival had become almost legendary. Air crews told stories that sounded impossible, but were true. One bomber returned to base with an entire section of its tail missing, flying nearly 200 miles without a functioning rudder. Another made it home with 2 engines dead and the cockpit half gone, the pilot guiding it by hand until the wheels touched down. One famous photo showed a B-17 sliced nearly in half by a mid-air collision, and yet somehow the front half still managed to land safely. To the Germans who saw these machines through gun sights, it was maddening. They poured cannon shells into them, set them ablaze, and still watched them crawl away, leaking fuel and smoke, but alive. It was as if the fortresses themselves had a will of their own. The Luftwaffe's technical reports grew darker. They admitted that even when damaged beyond reason, the enemy bombers frequently continue to fly and must be destroyed completely. In other words, don't stop shooting until it's falling apart. On the ground, German morale was crumbling. Civilians watched endless streams of bombers fly overhead, dropping destruction that seemed to come from another world. The firebombing of Hamburg, the raids on Berlin and Dresden, each one hammered the point home. Germany's air defense could no longer protect its people. The very thing the Luftwaffe once promised, control of the skies, was gone. And yet, inside those B-17s, survival never felt certain. Every mission was a gamble with death. Crews watched their friends vanish in fireballs beside them, then looked at the holes in their own fuselage and wondered how they were still breathing. The fortress might have been tough, but it wasn't merciful. Every scar on its metal skin told a story of someone who didn't make it back. Still, as 1945 dawned, the outcome was clear. The Luftwaffe had spent everything it had, fuel, pilots, planes, pride, and the sky it once ruled now belonged to the very bombers it had mocked. The Flying Fortress had done more than survive. It had buried its enemy in its wake. But even as victory loomed, one question lingered. How could a machine, no matter how powerful, change the course of an entire war? The answer lies not just in its design, but in what it came to represent. When the war finally ended, the skies over Europe were eerily quiet. The smoke had cleared, the guns had fallen silent, and the once endless drone of engines was gone. What remained was a memory of courage, loss, and iron will etched into the clouds themselves. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was shattered. Its airfields were craters. Its pilots, the few who survived, were haunted by what they'd seen. And above it all stood the silhouette of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the machine they had once laughed at. The B-17 didn't win the war alone, but it changed how wars were fought. It proved that air power could cripple an enemy not just by destroying factories or rail lines, but by breaking morale, by reaching places once thought untouchable. Its very presence reshaped the psychology of conflict. The idea that no city, no stronghold, and no army was beyond reach became a new kind of warfare, one built not on territory, but on the control of the sky. Yet behind that grand strategy was something deeply human. Each fortress carried 10 men who faced death every time they took off, 10 men who trusted the machine and each other more than anything else in the world. Pilots called their bombers by name: Memphis Belle, 909, Ye Old Pub. These weren't just aircraft, they were companions, homes, and sometimes tombs. The crews painted their stories on the fuselage, turning steel into symbols of survival. Every return from a mission felt like a miracle. Every takeoff felt like a promise. Even the Luftwaffe's surviving aces couldn't help but respect it. Years later, some admitted that the Flying Fortress had forced them to fight harder, think faster, and push their machines beyond their limits. It was, in their words, a worthy enemy. The laughter that once filled German radio channels had long since turned to silence, the silence of men who had seen a legend rise from the wreckage. For Boeing and the engineers who built it, the B-17 became proof that design could embody determination. They hadn't just built an airplane, they had built an idea that resilience and unity could outlast even the fiercest storm. In that sense, the B-17's greatest victory wasn't over the Luftwaffe, but over the fear of failure itself. It became a symbol of the endurance of men who refused to surrender even when the sky itself seemed to be on fire. After the war, thousands of B-17s were scrapped, melted down, and forgotten. But a few still fly today, their engines echoing across air shows like ghosts from another era. When you see one climb into the sky, slow, steady, defiant, it's easy to imagine what those Luftwaffe pilots must have felt watching them approach: awe, disbelief, maybe even a touch of fear. Because the B-17 wasn't just a machine, it was a fortress that carried the spirit of everyone who dared to fly it. And maybe that's why the Luftwaffe laughed at first, because they couldn't imagine that something so heavy, so stubborn, so American could ever rule the sky. But by the end, as the world burned and rebuilt itself beneath those wings, no one was laughing anymore. The fortress had earned its name, and the sky, once full of laughter and arrogance, had become a monument to resilience, forged in fire, sealed in steel, and remembered forever.